47 minutes of defiance, deception, and disappointment. Our fourth story on the countdown, the 47th and final solo news conference of President George W. Bush. We're joined now by our own Richard Wolff, senior White House correspondent for Newsweek magazine. Richard, good evening.
Good evening, Keith.
You've been covering this president and this presidency for 8 years. What foremost stuck in your mind going out of that interview?
Well, I suppose what really struck me was the lack of awareness that he displayed throughout, the lack of self-awareness, the lack of understanding about the impacts of his policy, his position in the world, but even just about himself. I mean, it's very striking when you compare him to the incoming president, who has this extraordinary capacity to look at himself and his surroundings. But when you look at what he said, for instance, about 9/11, he's obviously traumatized, understandably, by the events of 9/11. But then he goes on to say, look at all the criticism I had, the people asking, how could you not connect the dots? And that's fine, but then in the same breath, the same answer, he goes on and says, but I don't listen to the press, I don't listen to my critics. On the one hand, he's traumatized by the response, and on the other hand, he shuts it out completely. And after 8 years in this office, after reading all those presidential biographies, there's still just a core contradiction at the heart of this man.
A great point. His defiance over, of all things, two in particular, the loss of American moral standing in the world, the mishandling of Katrina. Is he not out there almost literally on his own on both those points? I mean, aren't those two parts of his legacy the ones that might be pretty much historically indisputable?
Well, you can talk to any number of former administration officials who would agree that they are indisputable. Well, what interests me here is how he disputed them. The whole point about Katrina, saying that, well, they rescued all those people from the rooftops, as if the lack of law and order, the complete collapse of law and order, the failure to deliver basic supplies of water, food, communications, transport, all those things either not learned since, and certainly not learned at the time, and no flicker of recognition from them. Again, an extraordinary performance. Beyond
exaggerations or putting the cart before the horse and the examples that you just gave, I mean, the president also said he inherited a recession when it actually started after he'd been in office for 2 months. He said he'd worked hard for peace in the Middle East. Really, he put it on the back burner until after the death of Arafat in 2004. And those 30,000 evacuations in New Orleans were presented as if he had ordered them or somehow arranged them, when that was the Coast Guard and it was acting on its own authority. What in the context of that disconnect that you're mentioning between the president and the reality surrounding him, what should we call statements like those?
Sad, actually. I think they're sad that in the middle of all of this, that he couldn't come up with really a substantive point about Iraq, which is the biggest failure of all. I mean, in one sense, he's right. He said what matters about a president is how you respond to a problem, not when the problem started. But about Iraq, well, he started the problem. And again, this almost delusional problem with being aware of what happened in his own term and what he was responsible for. It really is striking.
So did we get ultimately any admission, any real last-minute copping to his sins, as in the, always in the denouements of the Shakespearean tragedies, besides that one about the mission accomplished banner?
No, I think to be Shakespearean, he was more like Macbeth after Lady Macbeth dies. You know, the line about life's a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage. You know, this was a president who came in believing that the presidency was about a performance, and we saw the final act today.
Richard Wolff of Newsweek and MSNBC, the final act, at least until the farewell speech on Thursday night he's just announced as well. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Keith.